Hey guys, welcome back to Fast Films. I'm John and today we are going to cover a 2020 comedy horror film called Roadhead. The movie flips off in the middle of a desert road where a couple is driving at night. The boy asks to change the music and their conversation gradually turns into a romantic experience. Suddenly, the guy sees a tall man standing in front of them, with Vikings clothing and a sword. Before we even know it, both of their heads are seen on the car's hood and the scene fades out. Up next, we see a group of three people driving towards Azola Lake in their van. The girl named Stephanie rolls her weed while the queer couple sits in the front. Alex uses his map to point out the places while his boyfriend, Brian, drives the van. As Alex reads the roadmap, Stephanie begins to roast him upon not being able to use the smartphone and its GPS. Alex soon gets fed up, so Brian tries to bring a truce among his boyfriend and his friend. Gradually, they get along well and start joking. In the meantime, the bulky offender stares at the van from a distance and starts walking towards it. On the other hand, the group arrives at a dry portion of land, which was presumably known as the Azola Lake. Stephanie becomes extremely frustrated and starts to roast Brian's decision to come here. Alex comes up to comfort his boyfriend, but Stephanie's mood is completely ruined. Alex comes up for Brian's defense and starts arguing with Stephanie. He mentions that she's here to forget about David, who's Stephanie's ex-boyfriend. Their fight escalates, but Brian comes ahead and calms down Stephanie. He then begins to dance for her to lift her mood and eventually becomes successful with it. As the gay couple decides to walk out, Stephanie makes the decision to smoke weed and get high. Meanwhile, Alex and Brian walk away. Alex mentions that he wanted the trip for just the two of them, upon which Brian promises him that they'll go on the trip later on. On the other hand, Stephanie is smoking her blunt when she suddenly spots a silhouette on the horizon. Suddenly, something moves behind her and she gets alert. But it turns out that it's David and Stephanie's imagination. He talks to her and asks her to come home, but she radically ignores him. On the other hand, Brian takes his camera and starts snapping pictures of cracks on the desert ground. He devises a philosophy behind the mystical crack patterns while Alex simply looks at him admiringly. After he's finished, Brian gives the camera to Alex so that his pictures can be snapped. In the meantime, Stephanie is still being bothered by David. So, in order to push him away, she goes to sit in the van and light up a blunt, but he appears next to her. In sheer frustration, she hits him in the face and that makes his illusion disappear with a whiff. Back to the couple, we see them snapping pictures. Brian gets a text from Stephanie that she's getting high and going to sleep. Alex sees that as an opportunity to spend a good time with his boyfriend, so they both dash to the van. As Brian begins to drive, Alex gets the idea to please him. Suddenly, the heads appear on the road and Brian brakes hard. Stephanie wakes up as well. Meanwhile, Brian starts whining in pain. Nevertheless, they get out of the van and Stephanie sits down to analyze the heads. She then lands a prayer for their bodiless souls. After that humorous moment, she calls the police to tell them about the heads in the middle of the desert. In the interim, Stephanie's eyes catch the horror of the offender as he stands right behind them. Alex and Brian turn around to see him as well. Alex stupidly begins to talk to the burly man, who stands dead silent. After a while, he suddenly lifts up his sword and starts chasing them. Brian falls down and the man overpowers him. Eventually, he finishes him off, while Alex and Stephanie run for their dear lives. They keep running until the van gets out of sight. They both start losing their calms as Alex cries about the loss of his lover. Just before they can decide anything, the van suddenly appears behind them and starts chasing them. They get on the run again, but the van simply passes straight ahead. Following a long walk, they arrive at a place where they see a camper van parked in the distance. Stephanie uses the binoculars to take a look and then begins to move towards it in the hope to find some food, water, or cellular assistance inside. As they reach the camper, they find it in very poor condition. Nevertheless, Stephanie opens the door and gets a whiff of severe odor. As they go inside, both of them witness extreme filth inside, and it turns out that the camper is the living place of the attacker. They both start shuffling around looking for things when Alex suddenly sees the man standing outside. He makes Stephanie aware of the situation, but she starts hallucinating about David. David stands before her and states that she needs him, but Stephanie uses all her focus to forget about him. In the meantime, the man starts moving towards the camper and Alex becomes scared. Stephanie motivates him and asks him to woman up so that they can get to the van. Just as the killer approaches the door, both of them move out together and push the man to the ground. Alex dashes towards their van while Stephanie gets chased by the attacker. They both indulge in a fight where Stephanie dominates the guy and punches him repeatedly. Meanwhile, Alex can't open the van and he sees that his phone is in the cup holder. Therefore, he runs back to tell Stephanie about it. The attacker uses that opportunity to hit back at Stephanie. He gets up and lands a gash on Stephanie's collarbone. Moreover, he smashes her cell phone. Just before she can attack back, David appears between them and that eventually makes Stephanie leave with Alex. Both of them then walk in the desert with nothing in prospect. As they're talking, Alex mentions that his phone was in the cup holder, in the locked van. That infuriates Stephanie to such an extent that she starts scolding Alex badly. Their argument gets heated and they both take out their frustrations on each other. After a while, Stephanie calms down and confesses that she was just jealous of Alex, as Brian was her only friend and she didn't want him to slip away. With that confession, things begin to calm down as they both revive the good memories about Brian. Gradually, the sun sets and we see them still walking in the night. Suddenly, Stephanie notices some flashing police lights in the distance. A ray of hope illuminates in their minds as they start running towards the lights, but unfortunately, they disappear into the darkness. Stephanie almost breaks down with disappointment as their last hope is gone. She drops on her knees and starts crying when suddenly, the van's lights turn on beside her. It's the attacker again who starts chasing them now. Alex runs away while Stephanie falls to the ground. The assailant then abducts her and takes her away in the van. In the interim, Alex passes out on the ground. On the other hand, Stephanie demands the assailant to finish her off. As soon as he replies, Stephanie becomes really shocked that he can actually speak. He then tells her that he's taking her to the leaders who'll have a better future for her and they will reward him. As they're talking, they arrive in a junkyard where Stephanie tries to strangle the man with her legs. Before he can pass out, he manages to get out of the van. As he goes out of sight, Stephanie slowly gets out and finds a shard of glass to cut at her ropes. But before she can get free, the assailant returns and forces her back inside the van. The next morning, Alex wakes up in the middle of the desert and begins whining about the events that had happened. When he regains his consciousness, he witnesses the van's tracks on the ground and he begins to follow them. On the other hand, Stephanie gets taken away to be presented in front of the leaders. After a while, two wannabe guys dressed in idiotic clothes come by and stand before them. Stephanie can't believe her eyes as she stares at the stupid douchebags in front of her. In the meantime, a woman also joins the party and walks away to sit in a chair. Suddenly, a third guy comes running while holding a scepter. He presents the scepter to his leader Dad, who takes an exasperated sigh upon his son's stupidity. As they get settled, they ask the assailant about the purpose. He states that he brought this woman as a gift. The men soon decide that they'll use Stephanie to make more babies and develop their clan, upon which Stephanie becomes extremely angry. One guy, named Larry, decides to have her, which eventually starts an argument amongst themselves. Another surprise is given when we get to know that the woman, named Felicity, is not a woman. In fact, he's a man, playing the character of a woman. Amidst all this stupidity, the men selected Stephanie as her girl and she's taken away. In the tent, Felicity talks with Stephanie and prepares her. Meanwhile, Stephanie tries to convince her to let her go, but before she can do anything, the leader comes into the tent. He then forces Stephanie to make love to him, but she intelligently makes him fool and hurts him eventually. The old man screams in pain and passes out. Just as she gets out, the assailant comes in her way, along with Felicity. But in a sudden turn of events, Felicity knocks out the executioner from behind and gives Stephanie the chance to run away for her dear life. Stephanie uses the opportunity and slowly staggers across the junkyard. She can't walk much and eventually passes out. Later on, we see her getting dragged away. Following the fade out, she wakes up in a car beside Alex and in sheer relief, she hugs him and heaves a sigh of comfort. Afterward, they both spend the time together in the car as Stephanie lights up the weed. As she smokes, Alex accepts the blunt as well and smokes a few puffs. During that, they both talk about Brian and all of his good qualities. They share memorable events and memories and together they enjoy it. In the meantime, they hear the van coming towards them, so Stephanie walks out to face the guy while ordering Alex to stay back. She comes out in the open and stands in the way of the van while holding a steel pipe. The assailant parks the van and comes outside with his sword. After a brief exchange of words, they both charge at each other and the aggressor manages to overpower. As she drops to the floor, Alex gets prepared to save her. Before he can reach there, the assailant finishes her off. Alex charges blindly towards them but soon realizes that he has mistakenly hurt Stephanie. He turns to the assailant and a fight erupts between the two of them. Despite his queer instincts, Alex manages to keep up with the barbarian. He soon picks up the skulls around and throws them towards the assailant. The fight begins once again, but this time, Alex manages to knock him out and by repeatedly hitting his face. Following the ordeal, Alex takes the van and drives away. During that, Brian appears beside him and tells him that he's proud of him. Tears appear in Alex's eyes as he remembers Brian, but soon, he recalls that he has taken the life of someone. He begins to laugh, but after a while, we witness that he's not alone in the van. Jared pops up from behind and attacks him. In the final moments of the film, The van comes to a halt and Jared takes out Alex's body.